to the Jewish Week Online. I'm your host, Aaron Herman, with the opportunity to speak with JT Waldman about Jewishness and comics. Let's take a closer look. Comics are a wonderful way to connect Judaism in an interactive and fun environment. And your exhibition on Purim was really unique in telling the story of Haman, Mordechai, and Esther. Tell us a little bit about your process.
What I came up with was a comic book version of the story of Esther. And so from 1998 until 2005, I worked on taking the original Hebrew text of the story of Esther, of Megillat Esther, translating that text and researching all the different folktales and interpretations of the story that's collectively known as Midrash. And I basically, through all of this kind of absorption of all of the interpretations of the story, distilled it into a comic book version with footnotes and rabbinic citations and original translations of the Hebrew, so that the story could live in the ancient Hebrew text, but also in my vernacular, which is English, but then also the vernacular of comics, which is a marriage of text and images together. So it was a medium that I believe helped tell the story in a more robust way, as opposed to just singing it during the holiday or reading it in a book.
Comic-Con just finished up, and we look at the comic greats and learn that many of our favorite superheroes, like Superman, was created by Jewish writers and cartoonists. What do you think is the importance of infusing comics with Judaism?
I think that they've been Jewish from the start. It's just we're aware of it a lot more now, and that's thanks to things like the Big Bang Theory and the Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. Look, when Comic-Con just happened, and they have the equivalent of the Oscars for the comic book industry, and they're called the Eisners. They're named for Will Eisner, who was very Jewish culturally, but not religiously. And then you have the work of Stan Lee, who's still kicking and making projects, and I think he instilled kind of a more kind of crypto Judaism into kind of superhero neuroses, whether it was with the way that he wrote Peter Parker or the way that he and Jack Kirby kind of understood characters like the Thing, who maybe weren't Jewish on the surface, but in the subtext they imagined them to be Jewish. Look, it's like talking about the film industry or media or really any kind of cultural output that the Jewish people had a lot of influence in helping to develop in the early 20th century. I think now it's just a matter of Jews can be out with their Jewishness, so that you can have stories that deal with being Jewish on a variety of different levels. Some of them are kind of memoir and personal, like the work of Harvey Pekar or someone like Miriam Levicki. Others are kind of are memoir on a whole different level, like Miriam Katine just put out a new book called Letting It Go, and it's about her dealing with her son living in Germany after she's a Holocaust survivor. So there's different levels of looking at Jewish identity through comics, which I think give people an ability to delve in at a level they feel comfortable with. So you can look at issues dealing in Israel by looking at the work of Rutu Modan, and that's very kind of under the surface political stuff. Or you have my last book with Harvey Pekar, which in the title says "Not the Israel my parents promised me." So there's a full range of kind of ways that you can engage with Jewish topics in comics, and I think it's the plasticity of the medium that kind of allows for all of that. And as a medium today, there are very few things now that you can create that doesn't have 10 other people putting their hand in the process. And comic books are very immediate. It's a pen and it's a pencil, and now if you have an iPhone or a laptop, you can make digital comics very easily and kind of get it out there to the world. Things like Kickstarter, and now Amazon is now allowing for comics to be published there. So technology is kind of also allowing more diverse stories to come out, I think. Because before you had publishers acting as filters, deciding what the masses would be interested in, and now you've got so many different production outlets for anybody to make any story now, there's really no limitations. So I think that's kind of exciting. One of the comics that was just up for Best Graphic Novel dealt with Jewish themes, but in a very subtle way. So I mean, they're there. If you want to kind of just curate to just Jewish comics, there's plenty of content. But I think what's interesting now is the way that Jewish and biblical or Jewish and Israeli themes kind of percolate into other stories. So it's not just so kind of siloed as it used to be.
What made you go into the world of comics?
Well, I mean, I grew up reading comics, so that was just my way of, when other kids wanted to go out on a Friday night and, party, I wanted to just stay home and read comics and draw. So, I mean, that's just, it was the way with which I understood the world growing up. I would dream in comic book sequences, and now it's just, with all the video games and movies now, with all the CGI, it's like all of my childhood fantasies are kind of coming to life. But I think it was just a matter of using comics as a way to explore my Jewish identity and find a way that was comfortable for me to deal with topics that I found interesting or challenging or infuriating or inspiring or whatever.
You've been at the forefront in creating interactive experiences and bringing Jewish roots and values through a unique lens. What do you think the best way is to communicate these types of topics?
I think that images, we live in a visual culture, so if you have images that allow people to connect to ideas, that's a little bit more of an open process than a word. I mean, in terms of technologically, I think metadata and things like tags are very important, because a tag allows an object, a piece of information, to have multiple layers. So like my technology projects with the tag Tanakh was about allowing every person to add a tag or remark on every word or verse in the Bible. So you didn't just have to be a rabbi or a trained scholar to have an opinion about these kind of greatest hit stories in our culture, or even some of the more obscure ones. I think technology is now allowing multi-access. We have multi-level types of learning. We now recognize that it's not kind of this one-size-fits-all approach. And so I think comics, because of the way that they require an active reader and the way that technology requires an active participant, there's a certain literacy that comes along with being in the digital world, but also being in the comic world. And so I think that I kind of weave my way in between those two worlds. And I think that those are kind of naturally Jewish environments to some extent. It's just whether or not it's, as like I said, as overt with the content. But the process, I think, is very Jewish. It's an associative thinking. To be able to define something by more ways than just one. It's very midrashic. It's very Talmudic. And so I think what's happening now is I think that's what the whole kind of rising popularity of big data and all of these kinds of things, because big data is kind of an odd concept for the Jewish people because we're a small group. So big data can be used in kind of extraneous ways or completely pointless, futile ways with us as a social group. But it also can allow for kind of very granular insight into different facets of Jewish communities. So it's kind of a macro-micro thing, and I think that's the beauty of comics as well. You have this macro story that happens on a page, but then you have these micro panels that the page is made up of. So it's that same kind of play where you have to cognitively understand what's happening in this one little section, but then relate it to this page, and then relate it to this spread, and then relate it to the narrative and the story, and then, oh wait, this story has a cliffhanger, like comics that come out every month has a cliffhanger every month. So the story and the act of reading in the present, you have to remember what happened before and kind of look to where they're going to go next. So we kind of take for granted comics being this kind of childlike thing, but it's a very complex way of reading. And I think that's why comics now are being deployed for more pedagogical use, whether it be doctors using it to improve their diagnostic skills, or teachers using it with middle schoolers to help with English language acquisition, or children with autism using comics life to tell stories about themselves and using the iconography of word balloons and thought balloons and panels and trying to frame their own stories. It's really amazing how comics have, I think, percolated and permeated our culture, and we still have this kind of superhero delusion or obsession with comics, where that's just one facet of it. It's like every time there's one of these successful movies, I'm happy, but I'm also a little frustrated because I feel like it shapes people's opinions in certain ways.
As you can see, comics are a wonderful tool to showcase the best of our Jewish values, culture, and religion. This is Aaron Herman. Thank you for watching.